My parents and sister said this about the shoes I bought them. Mom, not even leather? Sister, these make my feet look huge. I raised an eyebrow. They're custom. Moments later, I put them on auction and they sold for $4,000 each. So, I'm a footwear designer. I've spent most of my adult life the past 15 years building my own sustainable fashion brand from scratch. I work out of NYC, and while I wouldn't call myself famous, I've had my work featured in a few good places, and collectors know my name. I'm proud of what I built. I never asked my family for money or support, not once. I left home at 19 with a bag, a scholarship, and stubbornness. And I've been on my own since. Despite all that, I've always hoped they'd be proud of me. I guess some part of me, even after everything, still wanted their approval. So when I got featured in a design magazine recently, I decided to make some special custom pairs of shoes for my mom, dad, and younger sister Tessa. They were hand-molded, sustainable, and modern, the kind of piece people would frame before they wore. A labor of love. Their response? Mom, not even leather? Dad, interesting look, but not very classic. Tessa, these make my feet look huge, lol. That was it. No thanks. No recognition that these were custom, high-end, and not even for sale anywhere else. I didn't say much in response. I just stared at the text, felt that old, dull sting that comes with being dismissed again, and walked over to my desk. I listed those 3 extra pairs, the ones I'd sent them for auction. They sold in hours. $4,000 each. I didn't brag, I didn't text them back, I just let it go. Or thought I had. Then came my dad's retirement dinner. A family gathering back in my hometown of Fairfield, Connecticut. I went. I gave a speech that was nothing dramatic, just honest. Something about resilience, about choosing to walk away when you're not seen. And later, I wrote about the experience on my brand's blog. I didn't name names. I didn't go into detail. But the story hit a nerve. It went viral. People resonated with it hard. Apparently, a lot of us grew up in homes where we were tolerated, not celebrated. Now my sister and parents are mad. Not directly, of course. Tessa posted some vague status about attention seekers and rewriting history, and my mom left a voicemail that sounded more like a warning than an apology. And me? I'm wondering if I'm finally free, or just tangled in a different kind of family drama. They've always done this, minimized, brushed off, moved on like nothing ever happened. Growing up, I was the creative one, which in my family was code for not serious. My dad's a numbers guy, spreadsheets, balance sheets, suits, and savings accounts. My mother spent most of my childhood managing the image of our family. She didn't like surprises, loud colors, or feelings that couldn't be tucked neatly into a dinner party script. And Tessa? She learned early on how to play to that audience. Pretty, pleasant, predictable. When I was applying to design school, she was practicing pageant walks and prepping for a marketing degree. She always knew the right thing to say, the way to tilt her head and smile when my parents were watching. I was the opposite. I questioned things. I cried too easily. I wore strange boots and oversized jackets and once dyed my hair silver blue at 16 because I wanted to look like the illustrations in a graphic novel. My mother made me scrub it out before Sunday service. She told people it was a phase. Maybe it was. But what never passed was the feeling that I wasn't enough, or worse, that I was just a little embarrassing. Still, I never cut ties. I sent birthday gifts. Flew home for holidays. Laughed off the comments, even when they sting. When Tessa called my first studio cute. When my dad asked if I'd ever thought of teaching instead, just in case. When my mother told her friend I was into shoes like it was a quirk, not a career. And I thought, maybe if I just worked hard enough, made something really beautiful, they'd see. That's what those custom shoes were. Not just art, an olive branch. And they stepped on it. I'll never forget how casually they dismissed them. My mother's message, not even leather? I can still hear her voice in my head. A mix of confusion and judgment. Like it was a question and a complaint at the same time. And Tessa, with her "these make my feet look huge lol." They didn't ask how long I spent molding those soles, or how I sourced the materials, or what it meant to finally be in a place where I could send them something entirely made by my hands and heart. They didn't see me. Not really. So I sold them. To strangers. Who paid $4,000 a pair. No questions asked. And for the first time, I felt like maybe I didn't need them to understand. Maybe I just needed to stop waiting for them to. But then came the dinner at my dad's retirement celebration at the Fairfield Country Club. A space filled with white tablecloths, fake laughs, and people who used the word success like it was a membership card. I walked in alone, wearing a pair of my newest heels, sleek, navy, and silent. Tessa gave her speech first, all about how Dad taught her to never settle, how he'd always been her hero. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye, and Dad looked like he was holding court. When it was my turn, I didn't pull punches, but I didn't throw any either. I learned a lot from my family, I said into the microphone, my voice calm. Mostly about standing tall when you're overlooked. And about how silence doesn't always mean peace. It got quiet. Not tense, just uncomfortable. And I was fine with that. After the event, I left early. Took a cab back to my hotel, opened my laptop, and wrote about it. Not with bitterness. Just truth. A story about giving, being rejected, and learning that validation doesn't always come from the places you hope. 3 days later, my traffic exploded. People got it. I wasn't alone. And that's when my family started spinning. At first, it was just a few DMs. Then emails. Then people tagged me in comment threads and reposts. The blog post I wrote, the one about selling the shoes my family rejected, had caught on. It wasn't supposed to be some viral sensation. I hadn't even pushed it out hard. I just posted it on my site, linked it quietly in a design forum, and left it there like a sigh. I wasn't trying to start a war. But apparently, I'd hit something deep. Deeper than I realized. I started getting messages from other designers. Then artists. Then random people, teachers, nurses, accountants, people who had never touched a sewing machine in their lives. They all said some version of the same thing: I needed this. My mom did the same thing. My sister acts like this too. I thought I was crazy. People weren't just sharing it. They were grateful for it. I wasn't prepared for that. I'd spent so long thinking maybe I was too sensitive, too dramatic. And there were hundreds, eventually thousands of people telling me I wasn't alone. But then the silence from my family started getting loud. It wasn't a "we saw your post" call. It was a vacuum. The kind that hums with unspoken tension. Until Tessa posted. She put up a blurry selfie on her Instagram story. Just her and a glass of wine, a cryptic caption under it: some people rewrite history for likes. But real ones know the truth. No mention of me. But we both knew. She followed it with another story, a screenshot of a paragraph from my blog, the one where I described the text thread where they all dismissed the shoes. She had underlined it with that aggressive Instagram neon pen, and wrote, "This never happened lol." I didn't respond. It didn't deserve one. But still I couldn't lie. It got under my skin. Not because she denied it. That was textbook Tessa. But because people who knew both of us were mutual friends, distant families, started messaging me. Asking if I was okay. Some more bluntly, "Is everything you wrote true?" It was. And I had proof. I still had the original group text, of course. Screenshots, timestamped. Every sarcastic word. I hadn't included them in the blog because I wasn't trying to start a feud. But now, with her trying to publicly frame me as a liar, I was tempted to drop receipts. Then came the email. From my mom. Subject line: very disappointed, no greeting. No punctuation. Just lines like, "This has gone too far." It's one thing to be creative, another to humiliate your own family for attention. Your father is deeply hurt. You're better than this. The irony? I didn't feel hurt reading it. Not anymore. I felt clear. Because for the first time in my adult life, I saw exactly how my family operated. It had never really been about whether I was right or wrong. It was about control. About keeping up appearances. About making sure I stayed in my lane, quiet, grateful, invisible. The second I stepped out of that mold and spoke truth that didn't flatter them, they spun it as betrayal. I didn't respond to my mom's email either. I saved it, filed it, and left it unread in my heart. Then came something I didn't expect. A journalist from an online culture magazine reached out. Said they were doing a piece on familial gaslighting and generational control and asked if I'd be willing to talk. I hesitated. I didn't want to make this bigger than it already was. But then she said something that stuck. You're not the only person who's been made to feel crazy for seeing things clearly. That story, even just that blog post, is a blueprint for people learning to stand on their own. So I agreed. We talked for over an hour. I told her what I told everyone else, that I wasn't trying to shame my family. I was just done shrinking so they could stay comfortable. And yes, they rejected something I made with love. And yes, I finally decided not to pretend it didn't matter. The piece came out a week later. It was balanced, thoughtful, and respectful. It didn't name anyone. But the message was there: emotional neglect doesn't have to come with yelling or slamming doors. Sometimes it's a quiet erosion, the kind where you're made to feel silly for wanting to be seen. That was the moment the shift happened. People started sharing the article with my name. Suddenly, I wasn't just the girl who wrote a blog. I was a case study. A voice. An example. And that's when things started to unravel, not for me, but for them. After the article dropped, the silence from my parents cracked. This time it came not as a call, or a text, or even an email, but through someone else. A woman named Carla, one of my mom's oldest friends, sent me a message through LinkedIn. It was short. I read the piece. Just wanted to say I remember when you were in high school. They didn't understand you. I'm glad you're doing well. It felt like someone had reached across a canyon with a candle. I sat with that message for a long time, rereading it. Not because I needed validation, not anymore, but because it confirmed what I'd always suspected. Other people saw it too. And now that the veil was lifting, I started hearing more. A former neighbor I hadn't seen since I was 19 left a comment on my business page: "You always had something special. Glad to see you didn't let Fairfield clip your wings." I hadn't realized how many people had been watching from the edges quietly, kindly, while I spent my youth twisting myself to be smaller, quieter, more palatable. I guess when you come from a family that values image above everything, you learn to mask fast. You learn the exact volume you're allowed to speak. And if you slip, you learn how to laugh it off so they won't call you too sensitive. Now, they were the ones fumbling. My sister started changing her story. At first, it was denial. Then it was deflection. She told a mutual cousin that I had misinterpreted their jokes. That I was always a little too dramatic. That I had a flair for the performative. But the problem was people had seen the shoes. Not just the blog readers. Not just the collectors. The auction buyers. One of them, an interior architect from Atlanta, posted a video unboxing a pair with the caption, "When art meets pain and turns it into power." It had 200,000 views. Another curator from Chicago sent me a personal thank you note after displaying the pair titled "Fourth Chair" in her private gallery. She said people stood in front of it for long stretches, reading the plaque, tracing the lines of the stitching, asking who it was meant for. I didn't name names. I never had to. But I started understanding something very clearly: they weren't mad about the story. They were mad they couldn't control it. Because the second my truth existed outside their house in public, unfiltered, believed they couldn't edit it, or gaslight it, or wrap it in sarcasm. And so they pivoted again. My dad reached out next. It was a voicemail. Stiff. Like he was reading it off a napkin. Hi Noelle. Look, your mother and we feel like this whole thing got blown out of proportion. Nobody meant to hurt you. Maybe we didn't say thank you the right way, but you know how your mom is. Anyway, I think we should talk. Maybe clear the air. I listened to it once. And then again. And then I deleted it. Because what he was really saying was, come back to pretending. It's easier for everyone. But the strange thing was I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt done. Like I'd finally stepped out of a house I didn't realize had no windows. I wasn't seeking a fight. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't hoping for an apology anymore. I was building something better without them. I spent the next few weeks focused on my work. Orders doubled. Interest spiked. Not just because of the story, but because people saw themselves in it. Women from Detroit to Dublin were tagging me, saying they'd been inspired to start their own design projects, submit art portfolios, confront their own family dynamics, or just speak up. I started collecting those stories in a private file on my laptop. Not for a book. Not for press. Just for me. A reminder that truth, when shared without shame, becomes a map for other people finding their way out of the same dark room. But my family wasn't done yet. I found out through a friend back in Fairfield that my mom had started telling people the shoes were a stunt. That the whole thing, the auction, the blog, the buzz was a media move to get press. She didn't say it directly to me, of course. She wouldn't. But she said it to enough people that it started reaching me in echoes. And even though I'd outgrown the need for her approval, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a pair of shoes. It was about the stories we're allowed to tell. And who's allowed to tell them. I wasn't planning to go back to Fairfield anytime soon. But then an email came through from the director of the Fairfield Museum of Art and Design, a woman named Lila Dean. I remembered her, vaguely. She used to run community youth workshops when I was in high school. I think she once taught a ceramics class I flaked on halfway through. The subject line of the email was, Exhibit Proposal, Forms of Freedom. I opened it, half expecting a form letter. It wasn't. Lila had been following my work for a while, apparently. She'd read the blog post, then the follow-up article, then reached out to some people in the design world who'd bought pieces from me. She wanted to host a feature exhibit of my Misfit collection, the line I'd built in the quiet storm after the shoes incident, and she wanted to launch it in Fairfield. This town doesn't often make space for stories like yours, she wrote. But the museum should. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want the stares, the whispers, the old classmates who still called me artsy Noelle like it was a phase I never grew out of. But then I thought about what it would mean to have my work, my voice, my story standing in that town without apology. Not as someone's daughter. Not as the weird one. Just like myself. I said yes. The planning started quickly. The museum offered a private gallery space for 3 months. I curated every detail. 5 shoes from the original Misfit collection would be displayed as sculptural pieces, each on a minimalist pedestal, with personal narrative plaques mounted behind them. I wrote each plaque myself. I didn't name names. I didn't throw punches. I just told the truth. Each piece had a title, a story, and a quote from something I'd written or thought during the process of designing it. They were raw, clean, and deliberate, the kind of truth that doesn't need to scream to be heard. The opening night landed in early October. Fall was creeping in, and the air had that bite of new beginnings. I wore all black. Not because I was mourning anything, but because it made me feel solid. Grounded. Whole. The gallery was full. Design folks from the city came up to support. A few former classmates, now adults with kids and quiet regret in their eyes, wandered in too. Local reporters. A few professors from nearby colleges. Even one of my old art teachers, who whispered, "You always saw more than the rest of us could." But the face I noticed most? My mother's. She walked in late, wearing a pale gray coat, pearl earrings, and that expression she always wore when she was trying not to frown, just lips pressed together like she was tasting something she didn't quite recognize. She didn't approach me. Just moved through the exhibit slowly. I watched from the other side of the room as she stood in front of the display for the group text, the pair with embroidered cursive stitched into the lining, quoting the very messages she and the others had sent me. She stood there for a long time. Longer than anyone else. Then she turned, quietly walked out, and left. No drama. No words. Just absence. And for once, it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like a release. Later that evening, one of the museum staff told me that 3 visitors had asked if the show would be extended. "We've had more engagement with this exhibit in 2 hours than anything else this season," she said, almost laughing. I nodded, half-dazed. Because the power didn't come from some grand confrontation. It came from showing up anyway. At that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. I didn't need my family to apologize. I didn't need them to like what I'd made, or understand it, or even admit what they'd done. I just needed to exist in my full, unfiltered truth and let the world see what they couldn't. After the guests left, I stayed behind, walking the quiet gallery barefoot. I stopped in front of 4th chair, the open-back loafer that represented the invisible seat I was always waiting to be offered. I reached out and touched the smooth upper leather, tracing the edges I'd stitched by hand. For years, I'd begged for that chair. Now, I realized I never needed it. I had built an entire room without them. After the exhibit, something shifted not just in me, but around me. The gallery kept the collection on display for another 6 weeks. What started as a 3-month loan turned into a seasonal feature. They added QR codes to each plaque so visitors could listen to a short audio clip of me reading the narrative behind each design. I'd recorded them in a quiet studio back in New York, speaking slowly, plainly just me, telling the truth like I was talking to a friend over coffee. The museum said it was one of their most visited installations of the year. A few local schools even brought students in for art and storytelling discussions. One teacher emailed me later to say that her class had spent nearly an hour debating whether the 4th chair represented exclusion or self-liberation. I read that line 3 times. It made me smile. There was something incredibly healing about knowing that the pieces, and the pain that inspired them, were now being used to teach. But with recognition also came more of the other stuff. Tessa, for one, stayed active. After my exhibit gained traction, she posted a vaguely inspirational TikTok saying something about refusing to let anyone steal your voice, even if they share your DNA. It was full of soft piano music and fake deep expressions. The comments were supportive, mostly from people who had no idea she was talking about the sister whose work she once called pretend. A mutual friend sent me the video. I watched it once, muted, and didn't engage. Let her have her audience. I had mine. And mine was real. But it didn't stop there. I started getting invites. Design panels. Storytelling forums. Fashion ethics podcasts. Even a pitch from a small publishing press asking if I'd consider turning the blog post and exhibit into a full-length memoir. At first, I wasn't sure. The idea of turning it all into a book felt vulnerable. Final. Like turning up the brightness on things I'd kept dim for a long time. But then I remembered something my old mentor at Parsons told me once: sometimes we make art to heal ourselves. But when we're brave enough to share it, it heals people we'll never meet. So I said yes. The publishing process was slow. But steady. I spent evenings curled up on my sofa in Brooklyn, writing into the night. Not just about my family but about identity, and ambition, and how sometimes success doesn't feel like a mountaintop but like being able to breathe without bracing for impact. I wrote about the moments nobody saw. Crying in the walk-in freezer of the first restaurant I worked at after design school. Sewing until 3 a.m. on borrowed machines. losing two early investors because they didn't think a sustainable shoe brand led by a woman of color was a safe bet. And I wrote about the first time someone really saw my work not as a gimmick, not as a side hustle, but as art. The deeper I went, the more I understood, this wasn't just about my family. It was about what happens when you spend your whole life trying to earn love you should have been given for free. And how powerful it is to stop asking. As the book took shape, I got an email from Lila at the museum. She wanted to invite me back this time, for a panel discussion with emerging local artists. She also mentioned something unexpected: they were putting together a community arts grant for underrepresented creators, and they wanted to name it after me. The Noelle Anders Grant for Creative Autonomy. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was seen. That feeling of being known, without needing to be explained, was so unfamiliar. It felt like a language I was just beginning to learn. I said yes to the panel. The event was scheduled for the spring. I planned to fly in a day early and visit the gallery again, just to see it quiet, before the audience arrived. I hadn't set foot in Fairfield since the exhibit opened. It was still my hometown. Just not my home anymore. Meanwhile, my family? They stayed quiet. Tessa didn't acknowledge the grant announcement, though a mutual friend said she liked the post. My mother never reached out. My father, from what I heard, was annoyed that the museum using my name said it created unnecessary attention. But none of it got to me. Not anymore. Because what I'd finally realized, and maybe this was the most important part, was that peace isn't something your family gives you. It's something you build when you stop letting them define your worth. And mine? It was no longer tied to people who couldn't see me unless I was making myself small. The morning of the panel, I stood outside the Fairfield Museum of Art and Design holding a takeaway coffee, looking up at the building where everything had shifted. The air smelled like soil and rain, early spring trying to make a name for itself. Tulips were starting to bloom along the sidewalks. Kids were on bikes. I hadn't realized how much time had passed since I walked these streets without holding my breath. Inside, the gallery was quiet. The Misfit collection was still on display in a smaller wing, a temporary extension due to how well it had done during the winter months. Only 2 pairs remained in rotation, the others having returned to their buyers or moved into private collections. Still, standing there again, I felt something settle in me. Not pride exactly. Not grief. Just steadiness. I thought about the first pair I ever designed, the ones I made from repurposed belts and vinyl thrifted in Brooklyn, glued together with fingers crossed. And I thought about these shoes now, clean lines, story-bound, sold for more than my first 4 jobs paid me combined. A slow, quiet climb. Every step counted. I was early for the panel, so I walked through the museum. Noticed new exhibits. Familiar faces. One older couple nodded at me, then whispered to each other like they weren't sure if they recognized me or just saw my name on a plaque. Either way, I didn't mind. I liked being known in fragments. The whole picture was mine to keep. The event was hosted in the community room converted into a stage space, rows of chairs filled with local artists, students, curious onlookers. I sat alongside 2 other panelists, a sculptor from Hartford and a ceramicist from New Haven. Both are younger. Both brilliant. The moderator started with soft questions: inspiration, beginnings, community. Then she turned to me. Noelle, your work seems to walk a very fine line between personal storytelling and cultural critique. How do you balance that vulnerability with the pressure of public visibility? It was a good question. I paused, letting the silence settle. Then said, I don't think I can balance it, honestly. I think I'll lean into it. For a long time, I was afraid of telling the truth, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to upset the people I love. But silence is expensive. And eventually, you realize that protecting other people's comfort is costing you your voice. The room got quiet. Not in an awkward way. In a listening way. Someone in the second row nodded slowly. Another scribbled something into their notebook. I didn't look around for familiar faces. I wasn't performing anymore. But I did notice someone standing in the back, near the exit. Tessa. Her arms were crossed, a neutral look on her face. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't storming out either. She was just there. It surprised me, if I'm honest. Not because I didn't think she'd come, but because I didn't think it would matter if she did. And it didn't. Not the way it used to. I didn't change my tone. I didn't shift into smallness. I finished the panel with the same clarity I started it with. After the Q&A, people approached. Students, local artists, even an older man who told me he'd been at the retirement dinner months ago, the one where I gave a quiet, sharp speech. I thought you were just being poetic, he said. Didn't realize it was real. But it made sense, seeing all this now. I thanked him. Tessa didn't come up to me. She left before the crowd cleared. But she'd stayed for the full hour. And that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. She heard it. Maybe not the whole story. Maybe not in a way she'd ever admit. But she heard it. After the event, I sat in the museum cafe, eating a plain croissant and watching rain sprinkle the windows. My phone buzzed with notifications, mostly from social media, a few from colleagues congratulating me on the talk. Then, a text. From my mother. I saw an article about the grant. Congratulations. Just that. No punctuation. No warmth. No overt dig. But not an insult either. I stared at it, then closed my phone and placed it face down on the table. I didn't reply. There was nothing cruel in the silence. Only peace. Because here's the thing they never teach you about growing up: sometimes, healing doesn't mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means recognition of who you've become despite everything. And sitting in that museum cafe, watching people walk through doors I'd once been afraid to knock on, I realized, I didn't just survive my family. I'd outgrown them. Not in bitterness. Not in ego. Just in truth. And truth, real, steady, lived in truth, doesn't need permission to exist. 2 weeks after the panel, I was back in Brooklyn, sitting at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight was pouring across the tile floor, and my apartment smelled like cinnamon from the tea I always made when I wrote. The book was almost done. I had a working title, What They Didn't See. The last chapter was sitting open on my laptop, a blank page, waiting. I knew what I wanted to say, but I'd been circling it for days. Not because I didn't know how to finish, but because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't writing from a wound. I was writing from wholeness. And that was new. While I waited for the words to find me, I pulled out an old box from the back of the closet. One I hadn't touched in years. It was filled with early sketches, fabric swatches, receipts from the first art supply store I ever bought from. And at the very bottom, a crumpled envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, from when I first left for New York. I didn't even remember keeping it. Inside was a card. Blank on the front. Inside, it said, "Don't forget where you come from. We worry. Love, Mom." That was it. I read it 3 times. The words hadn't aged. They still sat just slightly off-center, not cruel, not warm. Just cautious. But what struck me now wasn't the message. It was the fact that, for so long, I had built my life trying to prove her wrong and right at the same time. Trying to become someone she would both approve of and never expect. Wanting her to see me not just as I was, but as something impressive enough to earn her softness. And I was done doing that. Because now, where I came from, didn't define me. I closed the card, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the box without ceremony. It was part of the story but not the whole one. Later that afternoon, I walked to my studio and finished the final chapter. No dramatic declarations. No bitterness. Just a story about a girl who stopped performing for love and started creating from truth. It ended with a line I hadn't written until that moment: some people only love you when you fit inside their frame. But sometimes, the most beautiful thing you'll ever do is outgrow it. The book went to print that summer. The launch was small but meaningful reading in a cozy Manhattan bookstore, surrounded by friends, mentors, fellow artists. There were no flowers from my family. No messages. No questions about how to attend. And I didn't expect any. I stood at the podium, reading aloud from the chapter about the exhibit. The part where I talk about watching my mother stand in front of the group text without saying a word. When I looked up, there were tears in a few eyes. Not because it was tragic, but because it was familiar. Afterward, someone came up to me, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her dark curls and a quiet sort of strength about her. She said, "I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until tonight. My daughter's an artist. I didn't always get it. But I will now." That moment? That was the real ending. Not a slammed door. Not a perfect repair. Just a circle closing somewhere out in the world where someone else could begin a better version of the story I had to write the hard way. That's where the story finds its rest, not in revenge, not in dramatic resolution, but in quiet reclamation. Noelle didn't win her family over. She didn't need to. She won herself back. And for anyone who's ever been made to feel small, invisible, or too much for wanting to be seen, she wrote a map. And left the door open.